Okay, so we've all heard of the American pastor dream, right? Well, we've heard of the American dream, but what's the American pastor dream? You know, you're working for your church. It's a big church. You have your job. You know your role. You preach once a month. You lead the small group community. You're training up all these people, and you know everything that you have to do. You've been working there for 10 years. But in your quiet time, you sense that God is calling you to something more. You sense that He's calling you to something different. He's calling you to quit your job. He's calling you to plant a church, maybe in a different state or a different country. And you wrestle with it, man. But you think, man, I got to sell my house. I got to quit my job. I got to tell my wife, our marriage is going great. I have to tell her that this is what God is putting in my heart. Pull my kids out of school and take them away from all their friends. And so you rationalize, you say, you know what, I'm doing the Lord's will right now. And so nothing changes. No big deal. Just continue on with your job. But what happens when we have the faith to radically obey God's will? What happens when we say yes to God no matter what? Well, we're going to look at a story in Genesis, and we're going to look at the life of Abraham, and we're going to see what happened when he had the faith to radically obey God's will by sacrificing Isaac on Mount Moriah. First, we'll do a little bit of a recap. So what do we know about Abraham so far? Well, God called him in Genesis 12 to leave his land, and he responded. And God made a promise to him that he would be a great nation, that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars. But there was one problem. Abraham was almost in his 80s, and his wife was barren. But he said, don't worry, Abraham, I will give you an heir. But Abe tries to fulfill that on his own. He has a son from his own flesh, and his wife is not having it. Throws him out. But God promises him. He says, I will give you a son. And that son finally comes into the scene. He's born. His name's Isaac. And Isaac is the fulfillment of God's promise, and all is well. Everything is just going great in his life. His wife is happy. God has been faithful to his word. Man, nothing can go wrong. He's in the center of God's will. Which brings us to our passage in Genesis 22. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 19. And here comes the curveball. God starts off saying that God tested Abraham. He says, Abraham, here I am, Lord. Here I am. He says, take your son. You know your son? Oh, yeah. Your only son? Oh, yeah, I know. The son that you love? Yeah, go and sacrifice him. What? You want me to sacrifice my son? The son that I've been waiting for my whole life? You just made a promise to me that my descendants would be as numerous as the stars. How can they be as numerous as the stars if I don't have any descendants, Lord? And what about my wife? What am I going to say to her? She loves that kid more than life itself, and you want me to kill him? Are you crazy? What's a time in your life that God has asked you to let go of something? Maybe it was a ministry opportunity. You've been working your whole 4 years here at Talbot, and you've been waiting to fulfill the call that God has put on your heart, and everything kind of comes together, and you get this opportunity, and God's asking you to let it go. What will you do? How will you respond? Well, let's see how Abraham responds. It says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and he loaded his donkey. Picture this scene. He's grabbing all the supplies that he needs. He's grabbing the food and he's grabbing the water, knowing it's the last meal that his son will ever eat. And he goes and he says he's preparing the wood for the burnt offering. And so every chop of the axe is coming down. And he knows that every piece of wood that he's chopping is going to be the wood that he stacks up and that he sacrifices his son and burns his body on. And every chop of that axe is driving home that reality. I mean, think about how sick he must have been to his stomach. How much anxiety, how much fear, and how much doubt he must have had. Has there ever been a time in your life that you stepped out and did what God asked you to do, but you had so much fear because you're terrified? I remember the time when I came here. You know, I packed up all of our stuff, we quit our jobs, and we moved to come to Southern California without knowing anybody here. We'd never come to the school. We didn't even really know where we were going to live about till 2 weeks before we got here. And I'm driving down the road, and I got all my stuff in the U-Haul, and my car's behind me hitched to the trailer, and my wife is following in her car because we had 2 cars. And I'm on the road, and all the stuff is, you know, we're traveling down the freeway, and it's like, oh my God, what did I do? Like, I just left everything I've ever known to follow some whim in my heart that God's calling me to be a pastor. And then on top of it, I dragged my wife along with me. It was gut-wrenching. I think this is a taste of what Abraham was feeling in the moment. But much, much more. But how does Abraham respond? It says, after a 3-day journey, he arrived at Mount Moriah, and he told his servants, you wait here. Me and Isaac, we're going to go to the top of the mountain. We're going to worship, and we're going to come back. What the heck is going on? Either Abraham is just lying to his servants, or he has the faith that something unexpected is going to happen. I mean, if it were me, I'd be trying to think of every single possible lie. And these servants, they're going to be my alibi. But I think Abraham's doing something different here. But I think he was tempted with the fear and with the doubt, wondering, is God really calling me to do this? Will God actually provide for this? I mean, fear of losing his son, fear of what people will think, fear of causing his wife unforgivable grief. Now, okay, there's probably none of us in here who will ever be called to sacrifice our son, sacrifice our child. But we may be called to give up something to some degree. We may be called to sacrifice something in our life. Maybe God calls you to evangelize and church plant in a dangerous foreign mission field. Knowing that it's illegal to spread Christianity. Knowing that if you get caught, you might get arrested. You might get persecuted. You might even get martyred. But you go. But at some point, you're going to be asking yourselves, did God really call me to do this? Did God really ask me to put my family's life in danger? I mean, would God actually do that? And I think these are some of the questions that Abraham has to be wrestling. These are real questions that we would be asking ourselves, and I think that Abraham is asking himself similar questions. But how does he respond? How does he respond to this? Every opportunity that Abraham has to freak out, lose his cool, he responds with faith. As he's trekking up the hill with Isaac, Isaac intuitively picks out, he says, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where's the sacrifice? That's a good question, son. God will provide. At every point of extreme tension, Abraham just models radical faith, radical obedience. And they reach the top of the mountain, and this is kind of the climax of the entire story. They reach the top of the mountain, and it seems like time seems to slow down at this point. Abraham's stacking each piece of wood one by one, and he has to put it perfectly to stabilize, so that way when he sacrifices his son and burns him on top of the altar, that it will support his weight. And I think that he's holding back the tears as he goes and he reaches for Isaac. And Isaac looks at him and he sees nothing but deep grief. And he looks back at Isaac And Isaac just has fear and panic in his eyes, and he's looking to his father, and he's crying, and he's saying, Lord, Father, please, please don't do this. Abraham puts him on top of the altar. And he grabs the knife that he's just sharpened, and he raises it up, and he's looking up into the sky, and he pauses, and he's about to plunge it down into his son. I've never experienced this much tension in my life. But I think that this is the tension that people would feel right before they're about to get martyred for their faith. They've just been captured and caught, and they're about to face the consequences of their actions for disobeying the government and radically obeying God. And I think for a second they're thinking, God, where are you? How could you let this happen? Why have you forsaken me? And I think that Abraham is looking up into the sky. He's saying, God, where are you? How could you let this happen? Why have you forsaken me? And he goes to plunge down, and God says, wait. Don't touch him. Don't you lay a hand on him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your only son. And God rewards him. Not only does he reward him with a sacrifice, a ram to sacrifice, but he renews his promise. He says, Abraham, because you have obeyed, I will bless you. Your descendants, they will defeat all of their enemies, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. So what happened when Abraham had the faith to radically obey God's will? God used him to bless the nations. Friends, when you and I have the faith to radically obey God's will, he will use us to bless the world. This story is the foundation of radical obedience for the rest of the scriptures. Moses is using this story to communicate to the wandering generation, the ones that have just lost their parents and their grandparents. They're about to go take the promised land. And they need a story that will communicate radical obedience to God's will. And this is the story. And we see the same thing in the life of Christ. It's radical obedience to the Father's will, even to the point of death. But he knows that the only way to fulfill God's promises is to radically obey. And God brings about the promises into fulfillment through Christ's life, that the world would be blessed. And the same call goes from Christ to us, to his disciples, that we need to be willing to lay down our lives to follow Jesus. He says if we try to hold on to it, we'll lose it. But if we lose it for his sake, we'll find it. And I promise that you and I, we will not only do the ministry of Christ, but we will do greater things. But how can you and I do greater things if we don't have the faith to radically obey God's will? So I'm going to leave you with this question. What is God calling you to let go of? What is standing in between you and radical obedience to God's will? On your paper right now, pull out a piece of paper, write it down. Write the very thing that you've been thinking about. The thing that you know is standing in between you and radically obeying God's will. And tonight when you go home, I want you to pray about that thing and ask the Lord, God, are you asking me to give this up? And whatever he says, I want you to have the faith to respond. Don't let fear lead you astray. Let faith lead you to radically obey.